All right, good evening. Welcome to the University of California, Washington Center. My name is Tanya Golash-Boza, and I'm the Executive Director of the UC Washington Center. All right, how many of you is your first time in the building? All right, welcome. If you have any association with the University of California or interested in things related to California, we welcome you. This is your building. For those of you that don't know, this is basically a very small campus of the University of California. We have event space, we have offices, we have classrooms, and we have 200 University of California students who live here in the building. So they come to DC, they take classes, and they do internships. So if you run an organization and you want some brilliant and bright and motivated interns, speak to me at any time, and I'd be happy to help you find some great interns. So we organized this event because it aligns with our mission of bringing the diversity and priorities of California to Washington, D.C. The UC system prides itself both on its diversity and its excellence. Here at UCDC, about a quarter of our students are white, a quarter are Asian, a quarter are Latino, and about 6% are African American. These numbers represent the diversity of the state of California and the future of the United States. So I know we've been saying this since at least 2020, but 2024 has been yet another year with tragedies ranging from an ongoing genocide in Gaza to one climate catastrophe after another. And amidst all of this, we have yet another historic presidential election. So as we were thinking about what would be most pertinent related to our mission and to have an event around the presidential election, we decided to focus on Latinos in the US election, since they account for a quarter of the voting population in California. So nationwide, 36.2 million Latinos are eligible to vote. That's 4 million more than in the 2020 election. They make up a significant share of voters in battleground states. And the issues most important to Latinos, according to recent polls, are the economy, which is generally important to everybody, healthcare, crime, gun policy, and immigration. But our panelists, who are really the experts on this issue, will have a lot more to share with us about what's at stake for Latinos in the upcoming election. So before we get started, I'd like to give a few words of thanks to our sponsors: UCLA's Policy and Politics Institute, Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, and their Social Sciences Department. Thank you. I'd also like to thank my awesome interns in the Racism, Capitalism, and the Law Lab, Leslie, Riley, Kai, and Mariana. Thank you. Yay. Thanks also to our IT team. And IT team, while I have your attention, can you put the PowerPoint slide back up on there, please? Thank you. I'd also like to thank our facilities team, and especially Mary Byrne, our social media and comms team, Mike Nieto and Tyler Hoyle, and our Director of Operations, Kim Jones, who pulled all of this together. Thank you. All right, next slide, please. And next slide, that's me. Next slide. We're not going to read any bios, so we're going to put the bios up there. So now I have the great pleasure of welcoming Christobal Alex, who has been a key player in ensuring that Latino voices are heard in national debates. So welcome, Christobal.
Mi gente, good evening. How are y'all doing? It's a real honor to be with you all tonight. Congratulations on building this center. It's my first time in this building. It's beautiful. It's so lucky for your students to have this opportunity to do this in Washington. It's great to meet many of you tonight. I wish that you all weren't so shy. You'd come and sit at table 5. So I don't know why nobody wants to sit with me tonight, but I promise it'll be a fun table. You know, I typically don't do evening events because I'm a proud dad. I have a Clarisa. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and it's hard for me to miss, pickup and bedtime and dinner time and bath and reading and all that stuff. But if it's something really important, and this is really important, I cut a deal with them. My favorite subject, of course, Latinos in politics. I think for all of you here, we care so deeply about that. So in terms of my deal-making skills, Vivian Sol, my 6-year-old, promised her chocolate ice cream tomorrow for the parents. Great idea to give your kid chocolate ice cream before bed. And for my 3-year-old, basically, I told Alessia, she's like, my baby boss, I don't want to go to school on Friday, or in her case, go to work on Friday. I'm like, okay, we'll skip school on Friday. CPS will come looking for us. In DC, for those who aren't from DC, if your kid misses school here, you get a letter from the school being like, hey, your kid's not here. So they're pretty serious about it. So thanks to you all, I'm going to get in big trouble. I start with them because you can't really know where you're going unless you know where you're from, right? And you can't look to your past unless you're thinking about your future. And for us as a Latino community, our not only our kids are the future, but they're future of the country, right? If you think about the percentages and the growth, the explosion in our community, the question I wonder about, and I think we're going to touch on that tonight, and you're going to hear from some of the most important experts in the country, is we've got this incredible growth in our community, but is our political power matching that, right? When you see those numbers you just heard about, Tanya, thank you for having me. When you think about those huge numbers of eligible voters, is it translating, right? If I look to the number of Latino elected officials in the country, it concerns me that we only have about 2% of all Latino electeds. And I think there's going to be a bunch in this room who are going to go on to be elected officials, and maybe the first president is in this room too. But are we bridging that gap, right? And it concerns me. So I hope we touch on that a little bit tonight. And for me, I think politics is personal. I think a lot of you probably feel the same way. You're here for a reason, right? Yes, it's interesting. Elections are fascinating and important, but like me, and I think many of you, we want to build Latino political power, and we're here tonight to learn about it, to make sure that our voices are heard. And I want us, just at the beginning here, to take a step back from the data that you're going to hear and the information that you're going to hear. That'll be entirely important. But think about your own journey, right? And how you got here and how your parents got here. And I'll show a couple of pictures. Let me put up that first picture, if you don't mind. So when I was a kid, my dad would always do like slideshows. This is back in the day. Like dad would come out with the pictures and like all the family would gather around. So we're going to have a little slideshow tonight. I think probably a lot of you share this history, but when I was a little kid, I grew up in El Paso, which is the greatest city in the country. I know it's not in California, but it is an amazing city. I got there because my grandfather, this is his bracero papers, right? Back in the day, you got bracero papers you came across as a migrant farm worker. My grandfather brought his family. My mom was the eldest of 10, right? They toiled in the fields from California, Bakersfield, picking cotton all the way to the panhandle of Texas, right? So that I and my brother who showed up could have what they didn't have, which is this opportunity. And that was sort of our version of the American dream. My mom would always tell us, Consuelo, when I was born, she wasn't working in the fields anymore, but she was working 3 jobs so that Richie and I, my brother, would have these chances that she never had. And growing up, I'll show you this next picture. We didn't have a lot of pesos. This is me before all my gray hair, right? What's funny about this picture, I looked at it the other day because we were going through some old pictures. So when I was little, my brother and I were sleeping in the same room. We had one bed and one mattress on the floor. And like good brothers, we'd switch off. So this was my night to sleep on the floor. And we thought we were rich. And we felt rich because of our family and what we had. And we never went to bed without a full stomach. And by the way, El Paso has the best Mexican food. Sorry, my friends in LA. From Chicago. Exactly. But you know, we appreciated the opportunities, but we didn't quite understand it. And for all of us, like the American dream is different. For me, my American dream may be different from your American dream. And for my brother, Richie, it was definitely different. I didn't know this at the time, but my brother is a person with autism. And I was a little kid. My uncle once told me, he's like, oh, you know, your brother's special. He has autism. Well, I didn't even call it autism back then. I didn't know what it was. And I didn't understand it until one day we were on the playground and I was 8, he was 9. You can show the next picture. This is my cool brother, Richie, and our awesome red pickup truck. And the whistle blew and we all had to run back to the class, right? You know, the end of recess. And I just remember this kid pushed my brother down at about this age. And all these bullies sort of stood around him laughing at him. And I didn't do anything about it. I just stood there watching it. And I don't know what happened. For some reason, I just froze up. I don't know if it's because I was a wimp, whatever. I wasn't buff like I am today. But it's a feeling of like shame and embarrassment and something I'll never shake, right? And I swore at that moment that I would never let a bully push my brother down again and not do anything about it. And that's the way I think about politics. When our community gets pushed around, I'm not going to stand by and let somebody get away with that. And in some ways, that's how I think about this upcoming election. And Clarissa, you'll hear from her in a little bit, who works at a very important organization called Unidos, and you'll hear later from Cindy Benavides at Latino Victory and others who really build Latino political power to advance our interests, but also to protect our community. And I'll make this quick. Because of this experience as a kid growing up, I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer. I was like, I'm going to be a civil rights lawyer and defend our community. And I followed this path, became a civil rights lawyer. My very first case, by pure luck, is representing a class of Latinas in a farm working community in eastern Washington state, up in Mattawa, Washington. This is a town that is small, agricultural, 80% Latino, no Latinos elected. Racist mayor, racist police chief, no Latino city council members. And they had their homes raided. The government conspired literally to raid their homes, claiming they were undocumented and they were stealing and all this stuff, which is bullshit. Pardon my language, you could hear some cursing. We sued everybody and their mom, the governor on down. After 3 years of really tough litigation, we win this case. And I bring this up because at the end of the case, this woman named Barbara Bravo comes up to me and says, hey, I'm really empowered. I want to run for office. And a light bulb goes off in my head, and I realize I'm working on one part of the equation, which is the redress side. The reason why we don't have political power, the reason we're getting discriminated, we don't have this political power. Barbara figured it out, and she ran for office and became one of the first Latinas ever elected out there. And that was a very important moment for me growing up. Again, like I think I was a kid back then as a baby lawyer, but seeing that transformation, which led me to help launch Latino Victory Fund, which works to elect Latinos up and down the ballot with Henry Munoz and Eva Longoria and others, including folks in this room. And as part of that journey, helping Latinos get elected to office, I meet Joe Biden in 2014. And my mom loved Joe Biden. And I was really honored to meet him. And I asked him right off the bat, hey, can you help us elect Latinos to office? He didn't hesitate. And he helped us, including electing Alex Padilla when he first ran in California. And we traveled the country. We got to know each other well. Later, he asked me to help him run for president. Of course, I jumped at the opportunity. In 2019, it was a difficult moment. Let me show you this next picture. We're in the middle of a campaign. And I get a call from Veronica Escobar in El Paso, Texas, our congresswoman, that there had just been a mass shooting. And what had happened was a racist drove all the way from Dallas, 10 hours to El Paso, 700 miles, to kill 23 Latinos and Latinas. And he used language that, quite frankly, is some of the language, unfortunately, that we're hearing today. But demagoguing our community. Even today, we heard some terrible language about immigrants, mass deportation forces. We're hearing about immigrants eating cats and dogs and crazy shit like that. And so I say all of that because we're to the point now where we have to push back. And part of what we have to push back with is our voice and our vote, right? And I'll close with this, that the elections aren't just about the presidential, even though we're going to talk about that tonight, but they're about what happens down ballot. Let me show you this two last things here. So this is a picture of a Colonia in Texas in the Rio Grande Valley. It's outside of Brownsville. According to the census in 2010, this was the poorest census tract in the country. 1,200 registered voters, only about 150 people vote. You see they don't have paved roads. Very poor. When the residents there challenged the local judge to improve the services, he said, why bother? Nobody out there votes anyways. And they asked him, quote unquote, what would it take to show proof of life? And they said 300 votes. Next picture. They organized, 500 people came out and voted. Next picture, same street 2 years later, you see? And when Latinos are engaged on issues like this, not just safe streets, housing, education, this is what really gets us involved in elections. And this is also where our local leaders will come from, our future leaders, our future presidents. So this isn't happened by itself. We've got to make it happen. Demography, as you know, is not destiny. And so tonight, as we think about all of this data and all of this information, also think about how we got here, where we're going, and how we make this a reality for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cristobal. Now we're going to move on to our first panel, which will, the panelists will talk about diversity within the Latinx population. We have the bios up on the screen and very long bios on the website if you want to know more about our esteemed panelists who have done so many things in their illustrious careers. Clarissa, I welcome you to join the stage. So we have Michael Rodriguez Muniz from UC Berkeley. We have Clarissa Martinez right here. Irene Vega in the middle, sorry. Ray Serrano and Christina Moore on the end. Okay. So welcome, and Christina will be our moderator. Dr. Mora will be our moderator, and I'll let her start us off.
Great, thank you so much. It's certainly, and thank you for those opening remarks. They're really inspiring and remind us why we need to continue to be in these spaces and continue to have these conversations. My name is Cristina Mora. Thank you so much, Tanya, for putting this together. Dr. Galashboza, thank you for leading UCDC on behalf of all UC faculty with the dedication and the mission and the values that only you with your esteemed record as a race and inequality and immigration scholar has brought to us. So it means a lot to so many of us to see you here. Okay. So this first panel, there's many things that we can talk about when we're thinking about Latinos in the election, and we'll talk about so many things, but I know we have another panel that'll be focused on coalition buildings and things of the sort. We'll talk somewhat about diversity, but also broadly, since everyone is working on so many different projects right now on things that your organizations are doing or things that are at the forefront for you right now as we're thinking about what's going to happen in about 2 weeks now. All right, but we first want to kick off with thinking about how we might be thinking about diversity when it comes to this election coming up. And so I'll start first with Michael. As you see on his bio, Michael's written a lot about the way Latino populations and organizations make claims on who Latinos are and what they portend for the American future. And so I want to start with giving you the tough, broad question first. What sorts of diversity should we be paying careful attention to for this upcoming election? And how can we balance both thinking about diversity and the importance it has with also the aggregate racializing patterns that we also know sort of affect Latinos broadly? Go for it.
Thank you, Christina. Before I say anything, I do also want to sort of thank Tanya, but I also want to thank, I did most of my dissertation research here in DC, beginning in 2012 through 2013, 2014, and people like Clarissa Martinez, Cindy Benavides that we'll hear from later. I just reminded Christobal Alex for giving me time. A lot of people gave me time in very difficult and complicated moments of elections and pushing for comprehensive immigration reform. So I'm absolutely grateful to be here, and I just want to say thank you for making time for a lowly graduate student trying to do work. So the question that Christina posed, I think, is a really significant one for us, which is simultaneously having us think about how the recent decade, especially, or the last 10, 15 years, has complicated many of the sort of simplistic ideas that were often in play about the Latinx population, right? Thinking about it in singular terms, a monolith, this kind of thing, right? So we heard the rhetoric of sleeping giant, more inflammatory discourse, the Browning of America, right? So these are like catch-all descriptions. And so over the last 15 years, I think intensifying, thanks to work of advocacy, scholars and others, there's been growing recognition, both within inside of the broad and diverse Latinx communities, that this is a heterogeneous population, that a kind of homogeneous, simplified analysis can't do justice to what's there. I think slowly but surely some sectors beyond the Latinx communities are starting to recognize some of that heterogeneity. And so I wanted to just signal a few, it's not an exhaustive list, of some of the kind of heterogeneity that I think are significant for us to be attentive to. Most of this is not going to surprise anyone who's been keeping up with the election and the kind of current discourse. So certainly I think one of the kinds of diversity that we need to be attentive to has to be gender. I mean, there's no way to talk about this election or any election to come without thinking particularly about the role and impact of Latinas and on the one hand. And I remember in 2012, 2013, coming here to DC again to do this field work and seeing an uptick in discussion, explicit discussion about Latinas and the role that they would play, not only in politics, but in leadership and beyond. But one thing that we've been seeing, and I'm sure folks have been watching the news, is a kind of growing, we might see it as sort of a kind of gendered partisan dynamics that are emerging here, right? With some Latino males being more friendly or open to the kind of Trump message on average than Latinas, right? So that being a significant potential cleavage, gendered cleavage among Latinx voters broadly understood. There remains, I think, significant national discussions, so national subgroups that I think would be important for us to think about. You know, there's often the conversation in Florida, for instance, of Puerto Ricans and Cubans, but I think elsewhere, still thinking about the subpopulations is significant for us. There's a lot of work that needs to be happened. This hasn't received as much attention, but thinking about Afro-Latinos, indigenous, sort of identifying Latinos and what the sort of political calculus looks like and what the partisan landscape. The last domain, among others, that just to mention is, I think, important, not just partisan differences, but ideological differences, I think, that are emergent. So I've been spending time, you know, thinking about, for instance, the Latino positions on the genocide in Gaza, right? There's research that has come out that says that this is a cleavage, right? With more evangelical Latinos feeling a particular kinds of way vis-a-vis Israel and others. Now, this might not be impose a central issue by which people are deciding to vote, whether they vote and how they vote, but in tight races might actually be quite consequential for the levels of enthusiasm that members of the community have. Also, the question of immigration and the rightward move in discourse around immigration as of late. And I just want to say, just to wrap up, just two other things. There's certainly other types of differences or heterogeneities to explore. But one I think is important is that as we continue to think about these differences, one aspect that I think is important is to maintain a kind of recognition that it isn't sort of, there's a way that the media often talks about these differences, almost kind of like innate differences among Latinx folks. Like, of course, Latinas would vote this way. Of course, Latino men would sort of be more prone to Trump without an actual analysis, a political, economic, sociological analysis, and also an analysis of how different sectors of the Latinx population are being recruited and invited and called to participate and think politically in different ways. And we have to analyze that rather than beginning to kind of essentialize some of these differences and treat them as political outcomes of politics. And to the last point that Christina mentioned is that we simultaneously somehow have to hold both all of these complex heterogeneities, which shift with time, region, location, history, citizenship, all of these other things, but also keep in mind a kind of perspective that is able to hold together the kind of commonalities, particularly, as we heard from Christobal, sort of legacies of underrepresentation, forms of structural exclusion, exploitation, stigmatization, these kinds of things that are also informing large portions of the Latinx population. So we have to recognize the heterogeneity that people experience those kinds of structural features perhaps differently, some more acute than others, but nonetheless, there is a sort of broader story to tell of the kind of structural conditions impacting more Latinos than not. And so I think that's a challenging part for us, is to do both of these kinds of analyses and to have our politics also reflect both of those circumstances. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And I just wanted to I'm just going to quickly interject a data point there. I run the Institute of Governmental Studies at UC Berkeley, and we run something called the California poll. And in June, we polled the California population, and we were particularly looking at how people answered the question of, do you think you're better off now than you were before? How worried are you about your economic condition, et cetera? Every single group had in California, white, Asian, Black, Latino, every single group who answered yes, some level of economic precarity, that they were worried about their economic condition. If you were worried about your economic condition, you also scored higher on anti-immigrant sentiment. For every single group except for one really significant group that would not translate their economic condition into anti-immigrant sentiment, and that was Latinas. Latinas were the only group that did not do that. And we also have, although the correlation was not as significant, we also have the similar trend with African-American women. And so I think there really is something important about sort of the analysis of diversity and gender and what's happening here. Because you can't actually say that Latinas in California are doing much worse than Latino male. There'd be no reason to say that, but they are not translating that into anti-immigrant sentiment. Okay, but we also have Irene with us, who's done lots of work on sort of thinking about political diversity within the Latino community. In fact, Irene has an upcoming book that I want to just make sure we plug. It's called Bordering on Indifference: Immigration Agents Negotiating Race and Morality. And it's one of the best texts I've seen coming out on Latino Border Patrol agents and Latino immigration agents. And so I want to ask you, if polls are correct, Irene, it seems like Donald Trump is on track to win a bigger slice of the Latino vote this election. Not by too much, but a bigger one, right? You've written a lot and thought about sort of conservative Latinos and Latinos and thinking about the question of immigration. What do you think is happening this time around? Is it that Donald Trump's brand of populism is becoming simply more attractive to a wider swath of Latino males? Or what would you say is going on here?
Thank you so much for that question, Christina, and also for plugging the book.
Go get it. It's out in May.
Go out and buy the book.
Yeah.
Pre-order.
Pre-order. But thank you so much for that question, and also for the invitation, Tanya, Amada, Christina. This is on. Yes? Okay. It's such a pleasure and a treat to be in this conversation today. So as I was thinking about this question about the growing support for Donald Trump among Latinos, I sort of went back and thought, okay, growing from what, right? Because we know that there's a long history of at least between 25%, about a quarter and a third of Latinos voting for the Republican for the Republican presidential candidate, right? There's at least a half a century of this, but a much longer tail. And so, but even when we consider that at least between a quarter and a third of Latinos will consistently have voted Republican, Donald Trump is still set to increase not only his support that he received in 2016 from Latinos, but also the support that he received in 2020. And, polls vary, and it depends on sort of when we're doing this polling and who, but it's anywhere between 7 and 9% higher. At least that's what the latest poll from the Pew Research Center put out, at least as of last month. And so as I was thinking about this, for me, the paradox is not that that some swath of the Latino population will support a Republican presidential candidate, but that this particular Republican presidential candidate with his xenophobic rhetoric, his racialized and restrictionist immigration politics, is the one to increase the Latino support for a Republican presidential candidate. So I think that we're right to ask what is happening? What is happening here? And the answer is that it's complicated. There's a lot of different factors. It depends, as Michael was talking about, right? We're thinking about different national origin populations, different local politics, generational status. But I think that there's a couple of factors that I want to flag for us in this conversation that are pretty capacious in helping us think about this shift to the right, in particular among Latinos and in their support for Trump. And the first factor that really emerges as really important is the kind of the college, non-college divide among American voters. So we know that white voters without a four-year college make up a considerably larger share of the GOP than of the Democratic Party. Well, that also is true among Latinos. So Trump is doing substantially better with Latinos who do not have a college degree than those who are college educated, right? This is something that is very clear in the data. So the question here is about unpacking what is it about a college education or the lack of a college education that makes someone like Trump more or less appealing. So that question kind of leads us to some of the things like the economy, right? Is it that the labor market segments that Latinos without a college education are inhabiting, that they're experiencing downturns, and that sort of makes this America First brand of populism more appealing? Or is it that it's people who are in these particular labor markets that are being invited to think about immigrants as competition, right? It's not, is it a sort of the myth of immigrant competition in certain labor markets, or is it, is it the reality? And of course, we know that most of the data shows that these are myths that people are being invited to think about in this way. The other factor that I think is important is, of course, immigration, right? The reason that increasing support for Trump seems so paradoxical to many of us, to many Latinos, is because of his racist and restrictionist immigration policies. But there are many ways that Latinos actually distance themselves from that kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric. Research has demonstrated, including some of the research that I've done, where I interviewed Latinos who were members of anti-immigrant organizations themselves, for example. And, they said, yeah, this is not about me as an immigrant. This is not about my family. We came the right way, right? Or the immigrants that came decades ago when my family came were different than the ones that have come today. Or I identify first as an American and my ethno-racial background is secondary, right? Those are just three kind of the more common distancing strategies. But the point is that when we say, Trump runs an anti-immigrant, anti-Latino campaign, the reality is that there are swaths of Latinos that can sort of reconcile his rhetoric and policies with their own positionality and kind of pretty, in what they perceive as pretty unproblematic ways, that this is really not about me. It's not really about my family. It's about somebody else, right? And that really, those symbolic boundaries really are shaping voting behavior. And then the last thing that I want to say is about the urban and rural divide. We were talking a little bit about the urban and rural divide. We know that Trump has more support among rural voters than he does in urban spaces. And, suburban vote is sort of somewhere in the middle. And this divide is really relevant to the Latino population, right? So if you think about, I was telling earlier about my home state of Arizona, which is a swing state. And if you look at when Biden flipped Arizona, which had been a reliably red state, for decades. The state went for Biden, but if you look at the rural communities that are predominantly Latinos, if you look at the map county by county, the counties that are rural and predominantly Latino along the U.S.-Mexico border in particular are red, and they weren't just light, like they were red, right? And so they're part of what happens along the US-Mexico border. Part of what happens in rural communities is a story about gender. It's a story about the growing carceral economy in rural communities, right? These are the communities where prisons, immigration detention centers are cited, and where you have a carceral economy where these jobs, these detention centers, for example, create jobs. And then a lot of, non-college educated Latino men go to work in the prisons as correctional officers, as immigration detention officers, as border patrol agents and ICE deportation officers. And then there's a political resocialization that occurs that I also think is part of that urban and rural story and that gendered story as well. So those are sort of the three main factors that I think are pretty capacious to help us think about what is happening here.
Great, that's really helpful. Your first comment reminds me that it was Reagan that first said, Latinos are Republican, they just don't know it yet. And even though it was JFK and Johnson who first tried to mobilize the Latino vote with Viva Kennedy clubs, it was only Nixon, I would argue, that was the first to actually lead a presidential campaign that studied the Latino vote.
That's right.
That actually went out and polled people and things like that. So there's long been a sense of embedded in a Southern strategy of cultivating a Latino vote as much as they could within the Republican Party. So thanks a lot. Okay. Clarissa, we're so excited that you came. Thanks for being here. And thank you for all of the work that you do at Unidos US. I know that myself as a scholar has long read Unidos and NCLR reports and have benefited from the advocacy work that you all do. And so I guess with this topic, I was thinking, what are you guys thinking about at the organizational level in terms of how to handle diversity as we're heading towards this election cycle right now? Like, what are the ways that this is impacting your organizational strategies, if at all?
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Go
and have some
ahead.
Fun. So, to me, it's fascinating. This used to happen with other things, like every time there was a census, there'd be like this flurry of press coverage. Oh my God, Latinos grew so much, right? And then I feel like the latest version of that is Latinos are not a monolith.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, what a revelation.
So we conclude that Latinos are not a monolith. We keep concluding
To me, the notable thing, for folks who don't know, Unidos US, formerly National Council of La Raza, we are the nation's largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. We focus issue-wise mostly on health, economic well-being, education, and civil rights and immigration. And the reason I say that is because going back to the monolith or the diversity, we are a pan-Hispanic organization, right? And we wouldn't be able to do the work we do were it not for the fact that there is a great deal of affinity on the aspirations and the concerns of Latinos across the country, regardless of gender, age, and Hispanic subgroup. Right? Are there differences? You bet. But there is a great deal of affinity there. And one of the things that I've tried to remind myself constantly is challenge your assumptions. Because the moment that you think you put your finger on the what of the why, you'll be proven wrong, particularly where Latinos are concerned. Case in point, right? Like speaking of, as organizers, I know more folks are more academics, but as organizers, rule number one is know your audience. And it's been fascinating to see how, even though there was a huge and very long fight to try to get people to stop using, illegals as a noun, right? Latinx, on the other hand, was like, boom, everybody's using it. You look at the polling, and Latinos don't identify with that. Now, to my surprise, the term people identify with is Hispanic, which happens to be gender neutral for those who are following that part. And that it is the preferred term, as we started, across subgroup, across gender, across states, and nationally, right? So anyway, sometimes I say that because I prefer Latino, Latina, and I thought maybe that'll be the one, and it is, and it's not, right? Anyway, so every now and then it's good to check on those things. It doesn't mean that we would stop using one term or another. At Unidos, we use those terms interchangeably, right? But particularly in the political space or in the organizing space, where people are trying to connect with a particular community, those data points are important, right? The other thing I would say is that part of the reason there is so much conversation about the behavior of Latino voters right now is also based on assumptions or what people would hope to see, right? So the pattern with Latinos, historically speaking at the presidential level, of course, has been roughly that about 1/3 of the support of these voters tends to fall on the Republican side, and about 2/3 on the Democratic side. And over the last 10 years or so, you saw Republicans lose some of that ground, and that was a windfall for Democrats. But Democrats did not solidify those folks to their column. In many ways, the Democrats have been getting a lot of the Latino vote without doing a lot of work, right? Not that Republicans were doing a lot of work, don't get me wrong. But I think that when people started looking more at non-white groups of voters, the next group they understood better was Black voters. And so the expectation was that Latinos had a similar voting pattern, which they've never had. Now, that said, it is true that Trump has not only been able to get back to the 1/3, but is going above that. And while many folks have talked about a seismic shift, that is an exaggeration. Seismic would be indeed, though, if he manages to hit 40%, which is the high water mark on the Republican side, which was achieved by George W. Bush, the last president in recent history, by the way, who actually cared about getting immigration reform done, just if we're counting, right? So things are mixed in that way too. So I think that given that the majority of the Latino community is part of American working families, working class families, the economy is going to be, this is an economy election, right? Now, that's not the only thing. And I do think that this election is going to be won on the margins. So are there folks for whom the border or the flip side of that, both negative or positive may be defining? Yes. But is it like some in the press and other places are trying to paint that greater Latino support on the Republican side is an automatic being anti-immigrant? That is also an exaggeration. And so it's going to be important to look at those things because whoever wins, I think Trump definitely is going to try to claim a mandate that Latinos want to see mass deportations, which is not true. In terms of also challenging other assumptions, if Latinos were indeed turning more anti-immigrant, then why do we continue to see consistency in what is the top concern for Latino voters when it comes to immigration? And it continues to be legality for the long-residing undocumented across subgroups, across gender, across states, with maybe now Florida becoming a little bit of the lower, but even that one was there. So again, you'll continue to hear me say this, it's important to check those things. There's also, I do think that women play an outsized role in the Latino social structure. It would also be interesting to see that with many years of folks saying the focus of campaigns and the focus of work should be Latina women, to what extent that also has had an effect in leaving Latino men as sitting ducks, right? Again, not saying that there are not Latino men that are this or the other, but at the very beginning when folks started seeing that gender divergence, immediately people started saying, oh, it's those all Latino men because of their macho culture. And the reality is that more of the churn with Latino voters is among new voters who by definition are young, right? So there's many things going on. Definitely, I think the economy is going to be the big one, but with an election as close as this one, though, you know, the point you can pick up on abortion or the point you can pick up on shutting down the border on the other side, it's going to matter. So I would just put that out there. The one thing I would be remiss if I didn't say is that these voters have also experienced consistently low levels of outreach and or ineffective outreach when it happens. And those levels are going up, but the bar was so low, right? That, I mean, you see presidential elections where 60% of Latino voters said they never heard from anybody. And we're doing like extra credit. We're not telling people, did you hear from the presidential candidate? No, anyone in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, right? And at the same time, people saying that they wish they had more information to inform their decisions on candidates. So all of those things matter, right? I feel like right now there is so much talk about Latino voters. Sometimes it feels like we're being more talked about than talked to. And no matter what happens, we're going to be part of the post-election conversation. If Democrats lose, they're going to blame Latinos because they did that before in 2016 when, you know, Latinos in every single state in the nation actually supported Clinton. Latinos still got blamed. Not white women, right? It was Latinos and Blacks, by the way, also. And so we expect to see some of that. Even frankly, if Democrats win, I think part of the conversation is going to be about the churn in the Latino support, which deserves definitely more attention. But bottom line to me is I feel like where Latinos are concerned, people are expecting us to bring a birthday gift even when we don't get invited to the birthday party. And so I will continue to challenge that as much as I can.
It reminds me of today I read in The Guardian that I think Harris is now putting out a plan for Latino male entrepreneurship. And now it's like, oh, 2 weeks before the election.
Yeah, wow, right?
I'm better late than never.
Well, no,
you know, I don't know, but
exactly.
but
That's
it's happening now. Yeah.
That's exactly part of the problem. And sorry to jump back in, but for example, we released a poll at the end of August where I think the highest level of reported support by Latinos, and I mean not just national, battleground states, less than 30% had heard from Democrats, and I think the highest on the Republican side was 21%, right? Now, again, any Democrat, and not just mail, but like, hey, text, email, you know, whatever. So that was the end of August. I know people say, well, you know, things intensify after that. Yes, they do. So right now, I think that it's about at 30%. And in battleground states, it's higher. It's like 40%. But that's happened in the last couple of weeks, right? And so when you think about the fact that more Latinos are voting early as well, then I think it kind of is more political malpractice, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll
Yeah.
see what happens.
I mean, there's also a lot of research that shows that campaign algorithms deprioritize or don't prioritize Latino voters. And so they're seen as lower on the algorithm scale of where a candidate's bang for their buck. And you see this mostly in local level elections. So that also scales up, right?
Yeah,
To have a broader impact. So if they're not being talked to by local candidates or sort of brought into election, yeah.
Campaigns have limited resources, so I
Yeah.
get it. They cannot talk to everybody. But with 1 in 5 Latinos being new, voting for the first time in a presidential election, that means they probably don't make the algorithm.
No.
Before the algorithm it used to be you start with the 4 out of 4s, meaning people who voted in 4 out of the last 4 elections, and then you do 3 of 4s, and the 2 of 4s, no, forget the other ones. That's where a lot of our
Yeah.
folks
Right.
are,
Yeah.
right? So anyway, now that everything is being turned into an algorithm, we also got to remember that who feeds the algorithm
Yeah.
also means that their results don't have to change things.
Ray, thank you for being here too. You've also done fantastic work at LULAC as the Director of Research and Policy. We've been talking a little bit about voter turnout, and I know that you've written a lot about voter turnout. What should we be looking at as we head into November here with respect to the Latino vote?
Yeah, no, definitely. I again, thank you for the opportunity to be out here. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Good. I think on the issue, I want to be a little bit different and I think it's a more kind of startling picture of what we see right now with the Latino vote. We talk a lot about, who's voting and what their degrees and gender and so forth. But I think, there's this rising narrative of the non-citizen voter. And you see this narrative kind of creep into this idea. And it takes me back further to something that a report that we did a few months ago, well, I guess about a month ago, maybe a few months ago, but it was a report we did on the rise of anti-immigrant legislation at the state level. And so we started tracking kind of from 2018, 2019, 2020. And I think I want to say it was in 2020, it was 51 bills that we kind of deemed, or kind of in some ways, anti-immigrant throughout the states. By 2024, it was 280 something bills. It was a huge increase of 400 something percent. And the idea was, what was interesting about it was these bills were proposed, but they were never enacted. So they're almost symbolic, right? They were like proposed out there and saying, and I mean, it was like whack-a-mole. Just to give you a background, LULAC is League of United Latin American Citizens, formed in 1929, oldest. We'd like to say we're the largest because my friends at Unidos are a different model, but we're membership-wise, we have 264,000 members, so we are the largest. But we can dispute that later. But they, so been around 95 years, right? And so we've been, the forefront fighting for desegregation, Mendes versus Westminster, you name it, we're there. And so quite often it was like kind of we joke that it's kind of like the 911 of the Latino community, because people call our office, hey, can LULAC help us with this? Can LULAC help us with that? And these bills were coming up, and our councils in Iowa were saying, there's a bill right now in Iowa that's trying to criminalize school bus drivers for not checking the immigration status of kids. That they would be charged with a felony for transporting, for engaging in human trafficking. Okay. In Arizona, there was a bill that opened hunting season, really, it was to kind of stand your ground that if you king of the castle doctrine will be extended to property. So now if you have a 10,000 acre ranch on the border, you could literally have open hunting season with migrants crossing on your ranch. And it was just like whack-a-mole, right? You're just like, who the hell thinks these things? Like, why would they do this stuff? But again, the narrative, right? The invasion of the Latinos, they're coming in here. I just remember back in the day, we had killer bees that were coming from South America, coming through. So it's like, we're the new killer bees, right? We're coming in here. And so, and I grew up in Idaho, right? Like my mom, migrant farm worker, my mom was from South Texas. My dad was undocumented from Michoacan, Mexico. And the stories, the narratives of like, Tejanos talking about the Mexicanos que no tienen papeles y que vienen aquí and all this, like, I mean, and they're saying it in Spanish, which is even more funny, which is, so I knew it all too well, but I was just interested more about how like the narrative of the other, right? The foreign other, the invasion of this foreign other comes in. And I think and so now we get into the space of this non-citizen voter. That somehow this election is going to be thwarted because of the Brown Menace is coming in here, and so it just happens to be about 2 months ago to this time. I think it was August 22nd. My boss calls me on Saturday, and he calls and he says, "I need to talk to you, and it's urgent. I need to talk to you." I think it was Friday night. He's like, "I need to talk to you." I'm like, "What is it, man?" So he calls and he's like, "Look, we had 12 people that had their homes raided in Texas. 5 were LULAC members. 3 of those LULAC members were in their 80s. One was 87 years old. 9 police officers came knocking on their doors at 6 a.m. They took their phones, they took their cell phones, they took their computers, and they took their voter registration card. They didn't target any just older Latino. These were ladies who were at the bingo halls, they were at the nursing homes, trying to register people to vote. And the allegation was they were registering non-citizen voters. So we're like, what the hell is this? Who ordered this? Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. And we're like, wait, the same guy that tried to get the nun lady, like Sister Norma Pimentel, they try to charge her for human trafficking for running a shelter for migrants on the border she's the head of Catholic Charities in Rio Grande Valley. Like that guy? Yeah, and again, the narrative. And so we're like, wow. And then the next day, a purge of 1.1 million voters. Again, we're going after those non-citizen voters. A tip hotline. If you see something, say something. If you see Latinos or non-citizens or people, gee, I wonder who they're talking about, right? And so, damn, Texas is bad. Then you hear the reports from Arkansas that they're trying to go, or Missouri, they're voter assistance. We're not going to allow you to bring, only one person can help 2 people in voter assistance. You can't, if you want to help your abuela, you want to help your mom, you can't help the tias. You can't help any, como de Juana, you can't help any of those folks. You can only help 2 or 3 by law. So that was in Missouri. Then you hear Arizona again. The non-citizens, 97,000 people were deemed as non-citizens. Kind of bit them in the ass because they found out, they're like, wait a minute, the majority were actually Republicans. The DMV did not communicate because they had in 2004, Arizona voters had to prove that they had approved citizenship. People proved their citizenship to the DMV, but they didn't communicate that to the Board of Elections. So a lot of those folks were actually Republican. The Republican Party, of course, like, well, we gotta, think about this critically. I'm like, no shit, so, of course. So then you have. So then the infection starts getting worse and worse and worse. And then you see our friend DeSantis in Florida sending police officers. If you sign this petition for Amendment 1 on abortion, we're going to verify your signature here. So they're sending police officers to verify your signature. That you're seeing in North Carolina the case where they have 787,000 folks who are deemed non-citizens. So just give me the data. Give me the data. Give me the Excel spreadsheet. So we can pull the Excel spreadsheet. I'm like, let's just do a pivot table. I want to see the vowels and the last names of the disease on the last name. If I can find those.
Lopez.
Rodriguez is the first Latino name is number 77. You know what's number 1? It's like Washington, Jenkins, Watson. So let's look at the voter files. Let's look at their voter registration numbers and let's see what they're modeled as. It's mostly African American. I'm like, I'll be damned. They're saying non-citizen voters. They're blaming us, but they're really going after the Black folks in North Carolina. That is exactly what we're seeing. And so you're seeing that over and over again. Again, the fight back. And so then we go send a letter out. You go to meet with the Department of Justice. Well, it's past its 90-day mark. We have to be very careful. I'm like, dude, what are we doing here? They're not playing by the games. Why are we? What is wrong? What is happening here? And so I'm like, how do we show the future of this? What is the trajectory of this? Where are we going with this? And I was like, there's got to be some kind of story. I'm like, Guillermina Fuentes from Arizona. 2 years ago, Guillermina Fuentes was a mayor of San Isidro. I think San Isidro? San Luis. There you go, San Luis. She was a mayor of San Luis, registering elderly voters. Again, she was registering registering non-citizen voters. They arrested her and put her in jail for 30 days. Just again, an image to say, try this, and you'll be like Yadmina Fuentes. You go back further, 1985, in Perry County, Alabama, and you see three folks. It was Evelyn and Spencer Turner. They were trying to get out the elderly absentee ballots in Perry County, Alabama. And there was a little young whippersnapper in the form of Ken Paxton, but his name was Jeff Sessions. He was the U.S. attorney at the time. And he indicted these three folks with 29 counts. And when through their investigations, they interviewed they harassed basically the elderly folks that they tried to register. And they ended up losing all the charges. All the 29 counts, the folks got acquitted from it. And those elderly folks that were registered, when the New York Times and the reporter said, what was it like? Was this your first time voting? They're like, yeah. What was it like voting? And they're like, it was my first time voting and it'll be my last time voting. I'm not going through that mess again. Mm. And I thought to myself, that's exactly what they want us to do. Mm-hmm. That is exactly why they targeted elderly Latinos, why they're targeting our community, because yes, 20%, we're new, but they want to chill that 20%. They want to send a message to say, we're not going to win by addition. We're going to win by subtraction. We're going to scare the hell. And so every single day, I call it the symphony from hell. Because every single day it's a new county. It's Mojave County in Arizona that says they're not going to print out ballots in Spanish. What? Like now, yesterday, Comal County, they're having signs in Mandarin, in Vietnamese, and Spanish saying, if you're not a citizen, we want to prepare you to just turn back now because we don't want you to vote because you will get deported and you will go to jail. And of course, it doesn't say it in English. It says it in Spanish, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. So the message is very clear. And so you're seeing this over and over again. You see it in Nebraska, you see it in Idaho, in Missouri, you name the state, it's everywhere. Again, the infection is getting worse and worse. And so I know I sound like very doom and gloom here, but I think we really need to educate our community to not be fearful about this. We need to fight back. So
one way to think about it is if we're thinking about what are aggregate patterns that everyone has experienced, this type of doom sympathy is without basis of differentiation. It's all Latinos everywhere, wherever they're at, sort of targeting there as well. Do we have time for questions from the audience?
No, we're gonna move straight to dinner and then
Okay.
people can just ask. So we'll move to informal questions at this point.
Well, thank you so much, panelists. It's been fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you so much, esteemed panelists. So now we're going to move to the dinner portion of the event, and to make this go smoothly, I'm going to call tables. So tables 11, 12, and 13, please go help yourself. Everyone else, there's still drinks outside. If you want to get those, use the restroom. Come back. By then, you should be ready to get in the buffet line. Is equally illustrious and also has very long bios. So I've just put very short descriptions of who our illustrious panel is, but you can always look them up on our website and if you want to learn more about them. But we're going to have Amada Armenta is going to be the moderator. And next to her, we have Monica Gosin. Yay! Christine Chen. And Michael Mendez. So unfortunately, Manny Mendez was unable to join us, but he sends his regrets and looks forward to future conversations. So I'll turn it over to Amada, who's going to moderate the panel. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope that you're enjoying your dinner. We're going to do a quick name correction because this is Monica and also I'm Amada. Really excited to continue our conversation today. So we're going to get right started. We're talking about coalition building and alliances. So Monica, I just want to plug that you wrote a book called The Racial Politics of Division, Inter-Ethnic Struggles for Legitimacy in Multicultural Miami. We know that multiracial coalitions have the power to influence electoral outcomes. And I'm curious if you can tell us about how your work and how we should think about multiracial coalitions, particularly in different state contexts.
Okay, thank you. And thank you so much for being here. And I'm really delighted to be part of this conversation. So in my work, I was looking at what would probably be seen as one of the worst case scenarios in terms of the relations between a Latinx group and African Americans. So looking at the relations between Cubans and African Americans in Miami during the early period after Cubans first came after 1959. And so it's a very different scenario than in other places. But I think it's really interesting to think about this in the context of some of the things we've already talked about in thinking about how Latinx folk are not a monolith, and thinking about the differences of perspectives amongst them and how that relates to others, such as African American perspectives. So just generally, we can think about how African Americans and Latinx folk have had a long history of building coalitions with each other, going back very far back in history, where African Americans often supported or were against anti-immigrant narratives that the United States was putting forth. So we do see this very long tradition of that. Also in the 1950s and 60s, you think about whether it's, with radical politics, all the different convergences among African Americans and Latinx groups, where they found those families of resemblance. And then that also translates to political or to electoral politics. So I think in the realm of politics is one space where people have been really optimistic about the coalition building potential between African Americans and Latinx groups. And so we would see this in places like Los Angeles, Chicago, the Gulf South, and places like more recently, people have been looking closely at El Nuevo South, thinking about how immigrants from Mexico or from other places have been coming into these spaces that were traditionally African American, and how has that gone in terms of the relations between the two groups. And while there have definitely been, there's research that shows how there have been challenges there. Also, there's research that's more recent looking at the ways that they're seeing these convergences that they have with one another and really advocating for one another. African American advocacy groups advocating for immigrant groups, for example, and those types of things. So definitely those overlaps between African American and Latinx folks in terms of the political arena become really clear on things like education, health, different issues that they really have found these overlaps. But I think that it is important for us to also engage with where are the divergences, if there are any. Now, with my work, I was looking at Cubans who traditionally have overwhelmingly supported the Republican Party, which has contrasted greatly with where African Americans were in the 1960s, 1970s, and going into the 80s. And so that meant that Cubans were voting against measures that African Americans were supporting. So there was that, along with a lot of other dynamics that made it a very challenging relationship amongst these groups. And that continues today, but in that particular space, it's interesting to note that even there, you can't paint even Cubans with a broad brush. That you were able to see in, for example, with the Obama, when Obama was elected, I think 2012, that the younger Cubans were supportive of him. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics there that show some more convergences among young voters who are Cuban and with African Americans. And so if we think about outside of that space, which is very unique and different than other spaces where, as folks were talking about earlier, in general, it is thought that, and it is the case for several groups, that they generally do, Latinx groups do generally vote Democratic. So there has been more of that overlap and those convergences. But I think that we also should take note of the difference that class makes sometimes when they're, and I think someone brought this up earlier too, that when there is this idea that there are economic downturns, or the idea that there are there's competition over jobs, for example, amongst lower class workers, that often that's the space where you will see that conflict between African Americans and Latinx folk. And then another thing to think about too in regards to this, and someone brought this up earlier, I think the other panel really got into this issue, is how a lot of the rhetoric that you find coming out of Republican spaces has tried to pit African Americans and Latinx people against each other in this term, in this idea that immigrants are taking Black jobs, that, you know, that whole idea, that's a long-standing pitting that's been going on. And unfortunately, some folks do get drawn into that. And then some African Americans get drawn into the, yes, they're taking over idea as well. So I think that these realities are things to keep in mind, but I think we can also continue to be optimistic about those coalitions that we've seen historically and that continue.
Thank you. Christine, thanks so much for being here. I want you to tell people about your organization. We just heard a last panel where we know that Latino voters are not a monolith. So I'd like you to teach us more about APIA voters and any overlaps that you see between their interests and Latinos' interests.
Right. Well, thank you so much. For Asian and Pacific Islander American Vote, we're a national nonprofit organization focusing on building political power by increasing voter and civic participation among Asian American, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So that whole category in itself is just very, very diverse. Just to give you an idea, so this year we were able to send out a translated mail with 2 languages plus English to 1.9 million households. But that meant we had 36 different versions for 23 different states in 18 different languages, right? And so with that mail, and you know, for us, it's always about a layered program. So then it's also about phone banking, text banking, and for those that have capacity to go door knocking and trying to identify those who really are limited English proficient, and also tying it to our 888 API Vote hotline, which provides translated assistance in 10 different languages, right? And so you can only imagine the way we work is that we identify local nonprofit partners that are trusted messengers in the community. We're not here to start another organization. It's really about convincing our established groups about how to integrate this work into their existing programming and to actually incorporate all this. And it really is about helping them resource and actually do this work. And as a result, the strategies are going to be a little bit different. The way the Hmong community out in Minnesota and Wisconsin, how they organize is going to be very different from the Korean Americans and the Indian Americans in Gwinnett County in Georgia, right? To the Filipino communities and Pacific Islanders in Nevada. And so when we do this work, it really is taking it into context, understanding the different communities, understanding how every state is a little bit different, not only in terms of laws and regulations, but also in terms of how our community, especially since 2/3 of the community are first-generation immigrants, and how we, what the lens that we bring into democracy and here in the US once we actually immigrate over here. A lot of the commonalities has been really fascinating because, you know, I have to praise and thank my colleagues over at UNIDOS because, you know, when we first started 30 years ago, right, when I entered the space and a number of us came up with this idea of API Vote, we were really learning from our colleagues in the Latino and the African American community. And throughout the decades, I would say, I look at the stats in terms of our voter registration rates, the barriers that we're facing, the turnout rate, it's quite comparable with the Latino community, right? Whether it's about language access or many times it's about issues of discrimination or our voting rights. I remember many times during our fight in regards to making sure that when there's legislation being passed around voter IDs, right? Who are the ones who are going to be asked all the time for extra ID, right? Who is being seen as the foreigner? It's many times it's the Latinx and the Asian communities, right? And so those are a lot of the commonalities that I've seen throughout. But it's been really exciting to see as, you know, these, as nail biting as it is with these campaigns being so narrow, at the same time, it brings to light the importance of voters of color, and especially younger voters of color who are coming of age, and the numbers are there, that if we could lean in, that we really can change the, you know, the status of what politics will look like.
Awesome, thank you. And I just want to make a plug. I'm also the faculty director of the Latino Policy and Politics Institute, and we recently issued a brief that said that the number of people who identify as both AAPIA and Latino has actually doubled in the last decade. I happen to bring some of our reports. Please take one with you, or I have to carry them back to California. They're on the table. Okay, next, Mike, question for you. And also everyone, Mike wrote a book called Climate Change from the Streets: How Conflict and Collaboration Strengthen the Environmental Justice Movement. Mike, we know that Latino voters have historically been on the forefront when it comes to concerns about climate change and environmental issues. Can you tell us about your work, particularly in this community, and how climate has been an issue, or its potential to be an issue, to mobilize people across groups?
Great, thank you for that question and for agreeing to moderate. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues. And I'd like to also thank Tanya for hosting this important event. As was previously mentioned, my research looks at the intersection of climate change, public health, and environmental justice, particularly looking at how communities of color have been active in the political sphere, not only advocating for strong science and scientific approaches to climate action, but centering people of color, particularly putting that public health focus and environmental development and jobs focus in any climate change or environmental policies that come out. And my book focused on California. California is often seen as a global leader on climate action. But about 25 years ago, a lot of that global leadership was focused on primarily wealthy white coastal Democrats and their needs of the environment and nature. And so I, at the time, before I became an academic, I was working in the legislature. I was previously also a lobbyist. And I saw firsthand how particularly Latino legislators were pushing sharp elbows, being the bull in the china shop, and forcing to have that people-centered approach to climate change, and essentially withholding and killing priority environmental bills of the mainstream environmentalists such as Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, or Environmental Defense Council, and would essentially kill these until eventually, as term limits changed the legislature, these organizations started to, not because they woke up one day and wanted to focus on Latinos and African Americans and API voters, but because politically it was an expedient to exclude legislators of color and the constituents that they represent. And so now, you know, fast forward about a couple 20 years later, what we see at the federal level, the Justice 40 initiative, primarily comes from the work of Latino legislators and legislators of color from California that put that strong equity and justice focus. And now my research, because of that research and other types I do on climate change and health and action, I've been asked to comment on a lot on elections and how are people of color and Latinos doing. In the 22 midterm elections, I was asked by Time Magazine and The Hill to sort of do a post-mortem in terms of an environmental perspective. I co-authored the Time Magazine one with Sarah Sadaquani, who's a professor at Pomona College, and we sort of kind of hit the traditional mainstream environmentalists for a lack of a campaign and focus on Latino voters in particular. They had about a $20 million campaign in the 22 elections and very little spent. So that really got a lot of attention for some of the mainstream organizations. We got emails, really critical of our perspective. And so now we're here at the 2024 presidential elections. And both Sarah and I, who's a political scientist, along with another political scientist, wanted to see have things changed much in those 2 years. And so we commissioned a national survey, about 2,500 voters, both Latino, focused on the intersection of Latinos and API voters. One, because these are the fastest growing demographic voting groups of people of color, and particularly, as it was mentioned earlier, the fastest growing immigrant. And interesting enough, there has been no major polling, national polling, done on API and climate change or environmental issues. And so with that, we commissioned that. It had some really interesting results compared to white voters. And I'll just read about 4 top lines. Of the key findings, Latino and Asian Americans are more concerned about climate change than white Americans, and this about anywhere between 10 to 15% percentage points higher. Latino and Asian Americans are experiencing climate change emergencies at a higher rate, such as air pollution, wildfires, and extreme heat. The last 2, wildfires and extreme heat, we see that at even higher rates than the white registered voters that answered our poll. A third key finding is Latinos are more likely than white or Asian Americans to face an information deficit on policies like the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Latinos in particular are the ones least likely to be reached out by Democratic campaigns, and specifically mainstream environmental groups. And then the last one I'll highlight is Latinos and Asian Americans are looking for government policy to reverse detrimental climate impacts. So we did some experiments in our polling and messaging on polling to see the trade-offs. If there was increased fuel costs, increased taxes, would Latinos and API voters be more likely to support renewable energy resources and other types of climate-related policies? And we see a significantly higher percentage of Latino and API voters that would support these initiatives than white voters. So I can go a little bit more into later, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key findings, top lines.
All right, thank you so much. So in our last panel, we heard about different divides within communities, right? The rural-urban divide, the educational divide, the gender divide. But all of you have in different ways touched upon the importance of young voters and sort of aging into the electorate, right? I think there's a famous old stat about how there's a new Latino voter every 30 seconds. And so I'd like us to talk a bit about younger voters. What impact do they have on shaping political agendas? Do you think that we'll see any differences when it comes to being willing to work across groups and build coalitions or alliances when it comes to younger and emerging voters? And that's a question for all of you, actually, so you can take it in any order.
Okay.
Well, so API Vote, we just conducted a young voters of color survey that just literally just came out. And so what we found is the commonality for this cycle is the top line issues that they're really focusing on is economy and healthcare, which is quite similar to everyone else. But abortion and racial ethnic equality is right there as well. And so I think, especially with the racial and ethnic equality, I think that's a different lens that we don't necessarily see in terms of the older, electorate. And so what's really exciting is when you're looking at some of these numbers, I just even reflect back even in 2020, for the API electorate, we found that over 21% of our voters were first-time voters. So that was really a combination of those who are aging in, right? But then also just those that also finally connected the dots and understood the importance of voting. But in places like Georgia, it was 26%. Nevada is also 25%, right? And so can you imagine if we looked at the Latino and Asian voters and the number of potential first-time voters, with those margins, we could really make a difference in this election cycle, right? And so, and it's not just about the presidential. We always have to remind everyone is about down ballot races as well. Because also to be able to govern, it is also about getting different parts of the government to actually be able to support what agenda that you're looking for.
Mike, you want to build from that?
Sure. Thank you for that. I think it really highlights the importance of the youth voter population. I can speak mostly from the climate and environmental side and looking at the impact of the youth-led movement. If we look back about 10, maybe even 15 years ago, college campuses across the country of this growing climate divestment movement of pensions and endowments, and how that was led by these students, activists working with environmentalists, Bill McKibben, and really setting up shop and having a strong impact on college campuses and their endowments. And that eventually led to other government pensions and divesting from fossil fuel industries and stocks. Eventually, that climate divestment movement spurred up a new organization, the Sunshine Movement, that opened up chapters throughout the country, and some may say in a disruptive manner, established environmental justice groups, people of color-led ones that were older, established there, a different generation, and then mainstream. But nonetheless, the Sunrise Movement, supporters such as AOC really put on the national scale, particularly here in Washington, D.C., is that to focus on the youth, and that the youth have a voice and they no longer want to be ignored, and to take serious some of their issues. So I think those are some of the biggest issues looking back about 10 or 15 years to modern contemporary times. And then also another tidbit from our survey on Latino API, those that supported some of these climate action initiatives were more likely to be recent immigrants, younger, and also in a constant connection to their families back home that also experienced climate-induced disasters such as drought, extreme weather, and flooding, and that they were in constant communication, well, not constant communication, but they would talk several times a month to these individuals and still look at the news about their home countries in terms of these climate-induced disasters. So sort of this cyclical connection of being impacted by climate-induced disasters here in the United States, or fleeing from climate-induced disasters in their home country, coming to the United States, being on the front lines of that, and then still having a connection to their family that are also still experiencing that.
Thank you. I think we often don't give enough credit to youth movements. I think, a lot of us in this room know that youth movements were totally responsible for DACA and have a lot of power when we listen to them. Monica, would you tell us anything about youth and coalitions from your historical perspective?
Yeah, sure. Well, one thing that just thinking about what I mentioned earlier that I think is really instructive is thinking about with for example, in Miami with the Cuban community, and how staunchly the Cuban community has held to the Republican Party, and seeing this dramatic shift with the younger voters in that context is definitely instructive for the type of change that the youth might play in terms of challenging the older generations, because that's a dramatic shift, because the idea is very strongly held in part of the culture of Miami, the Miami Cuban exile community. So I do think that's very instructive. But then also thinking about in other arenas, if we look at California, places like South Central Los Angeles, where, in the 2000s or after the 1990s, more Latinx folks were moving into these African-American neighborhoods that, people think of South Central. In the past, they just think about, hip hop music and African-American culture. But as we know now, it's very Latinx, those communities. And the youth, because they actually went to school together, they actually had to interact with one another, then they had this space where they built this kind of culture around their, being youth. And while their parents were maybe hesitant to kind of connect with one another because maybe there was a language barrier, other things, the youth really solidified this kind of new South Central identity that, whether you're Latinx, whether you're Black, it's kind of like this identity people solidify around. And I think that's really interesting to think about how youth are creating these new identities that surpass some of these barriers that we've had traditionally in the past.
Right. And it's just about growing up together, being in the same institutions, being in the same schools.
Right.
Yeah. Christine, I'm going to ask you a question that wasn't on my list, okay? But I hope that's okay. I'd wonder if you, since you're doing so much work on the ground, if you can tell us about some of the messages or framing that you all are using to try to get out the vote. And I'm thinking especially about like low propensity voters. What is it that convinces people to get out there?
Right. Well, you know, I think part of the biggest struggle is that we're also just missing from the narrative. Many times when you're looking at polling, it's always like white, Black, Latino, and then we stop there. So many times for our community, we're not even seen as being included as part of this electorate that we're talking about. And so that's also translates sometimes in terms of whether or not they're also being touched, if they're being part of the plans, of the field plans of engagement. And so we find it that we had to break that, starting with even just as a 501c3, the nonpartisan community efforts to like prove our point, to be able to get the attention of the campaigns and the political parties. So it really, it's not like a hidden secret. A lot of it really is just about, are we going on the doors? Are we actually having conversations with our voters to actually find out, first of all, to listen to them and to actually help them connect the dots in terms of what they're experiencing with the elections. One thing that I would say that's going for us is that in 2020, it was such a traumatic event, election time period for our community, because not only was it the presidential election year, it was also about getting the count for the census, but then we saw the rise of anti-Asian violence coupled with the pandemic, right? And for us, luckily, we had the infrastructure, so our community was able to be reached out during all those times, and we helped a lot of people really understand what they were experiencing was connected to decisions that were being made by these elected officials at the federal, state, and local level, and how that was tied to your power of your vote. Well, those scars are still there with us, right? And so I think that is also helping us be able to motivate folks about turning out to vote. But it is going back to the basics of helping them make the plan. We know studies have shown that if you help someone make a plan to vote, they're more likely to turn out. But something that's different from 2020 is that, and even 2022, we found out that 73% of our community are first chose to vote early or by mail. But in places like Texas and Georgia, they're making it a lot more difficult. So that means we have to go back to these voters and including all these new voters and try to educate them and helping them make a different kind of plan. And also to think ahead of like, what are some mis and disinformation that's also bubbling up in our communities? I think this is also another area where it's quite familiar with the Latinx communities, because it's all in language. It's in these silos, communications. For us, it's WeChat for the Chinese community, Kakao for the Korean community, WhatsApp for the Indian community. And so not only is it language specific, but it's also these private platforms where mis and disinformation can really brew, and you don't necessarily always have people to actually, like stop and actually recognize and provide more information if you're not in those spaces.
Yeah, thank you. I think I heard a stat recently about how much Latinos are targeted for mis and disinformation, and how even the organizations that try to remove misinformation, they very rarely are able to do it effectively in Spanish. So lots of bad information out there.
Right.
Mike, do you care to build upon this comment about messages or frames that work across groups?
Sure. One important thing to focus on, at least in the area that I look at, is climate change and environmental issues, is to focus on outcomes and really trying to have and frame the message that climate change is not a wealthy coastal Democrat issue or about something that's happening out there affecting melting ice caps and polar bears, but it's actually happening in our streets, in our own backyards. And one key way to do that is really focus on outcomes and really making climate change real to the everyday voter about how is it impacting you, your children, your family, and your employment. And that how climate action policies such as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act, not only creates public health incomes to improve the health conditions of your children that may have asthma, but it also creating jobs. And I think that's the biggest miss that we're getting with some of the messaging around the IRA and other issues. Is to focus on the impact to public health and jobs. And also, I would agree that the disinformation issue that is going on my other line of research, I look at how climate-induced disasters is disproportionately impacting LGBTQ populations, and that we see that LGBTQ populations have a disaster displacement rate 2 times more than cisgender heterosexual households. That's and it's largely because of various socioeconomic inequalities that happen, and we really hone in on this idea, myth of gay affluence, that the LGBTQ community is primarily white, male, and wealthy. Because what the reality is that LGBTQ population is 40% people of color, and the largest population that's growing of the LGBTQ population is Latinos. And that's largely because they're younger and they're more likely to also identify. And so I had been working on that, particularly dispelling the myth of gay affluence, working with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, with state and local disaster managers to highlight this socially vulnerable population. Over the last 2 years, we've had a lot of success, both at the federal, state, and local level. California recently passed a bill focused on requiring the State Office of Emergency Services to include LGBTQ populations, and FEMA includes them as a special needs population. So fast forward this election and misinformation. I wake up one morning, I get a bunch of texts, and Elon Musk had tweeted one of our webinars with FEMA. This is during Hurricane Helene, saying that during Hurricane Helene, FEMA is prioritizing LGBTQ populations over the general everyday person. And just seeing it got, I think, 42 million views. It was a Zoom webinar. My face is there. Luckily, academics for small potatoes. They focus on government FEMA staff, but looking through all the tweets, saving them and seeing several in Spanish that they were retweeting these. So again, Latinos being targeted, and that Latinos are not LGBTQ or gay is also part of that disinformation.
Thank you. I feel like now you can analyze those tweets for a paper.
Yeah,
Exactly.
42 million.
Awesome. Monica, you talked about South Central and young people in South Central, and it reminded me of this, that's something that we could talk about when we think about inter-ethnic coalitions, is the scandal in Los Angeles, a year and a half ago, when Latino politicians said both anti-Black and anti-racist things. I wonder if you could give us your reflections on that conversation and how it aligns with some of your work, particularly when it comes to the tensions or struggles when it comes to building across groups.
Yeah, I think it speaks to some things that were mentioned in the earlier panel as well. I think that there is a tension, and it just also reminds us again, and we keep saying this, that no one's a monolith. But I think one thing that I talk about in my book is just thinking about, and I think someone else brought this up earlier, this kind of ways that my groups that are disenfranchised, that are minorities, try to make claims to their U.S. identity. And sometimes the way that they do that is in ways that end up placing another group below them. And that's the way to achieve the American dream or to be more American than them. And I think that that's such a key tension there. And so one of the things that I talk about in my work is thinking about the ways that groups are trying to vie for some type of power, even if it's not political or economic power, but it's a certain amount of a type of belonging in the nation. And so towards that, what you're talking about with this example, if you folks are familiar with, there was some council, they were council members, I believe, in LA, pretty high-ranking, politicians who were speaking to each other, and they got a hot mic, I guess. Then they were saying, and they were Latinos, and they were talking about making fun of everybody, really, but they made some points about Black people, making fun of a Black person, some indigenous folks. They were saying how they were, not good enough, and they didn't really leave anyone out, in terms of the disparaging remarks that they were making.
Except themselves.
Except themselves, exactly. But the thing about that, interestingly enough, is that someone else might look at them as being part of the same groups that they're making fun of, right? And so I think that it's interesting how they were putting themselves, and it was about solidifying their power. They were kind of saying, we don't want them to get all the power. So, so it's interesting to think about those types of attitudes are also out there, not just amongst people like that who have some modicum of power, but folks who are just struggling and trying to find their place in society and trying to make themselves one up another group. Again, I think the thing that's encouraging is the backlash that happened after that. The young people, again, they came out and they said, you don't represent us, So I think that's really key.
Thank you. So we actually do have time now for questions. We have about 12 minutes, and I wanted to make sure that we have time for questions from the audience. I see that there's a mic there if anyone is brave enough to use it, but also you could just raise your hand and ask a question, and we'd welcome you into this conversation. Irene Vega, then we'll go here and then here.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. My question, we've talked about youth a lot more on this panel than we did on the previous panel. And I'm thinking of those that this election will be won at the margins with many new voters, many persuadable voters, maybe voters that have been agnostic about politics in general. And I think a lot of that is youth, right? So what do you all in each of the corners that you work see about, for example, outreach to youth on non-traditional platforms for us, but maybe like social media, right? Which is a very traditional platform for youth 18 to 34 and above. Are we reaching, when we think about how we reach new and agnostic voters, are we reaching them in the ways that they are open to being reached? Or are we using methods perhaps that could be outdated given
Exactly, like they're not on Facebook anymore.
They're not on Facebook.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great question for Christine.
Or maybe they're not home and are afraid of face-to-face interaction. Right. So
Yeah.
So, I mean, it does go back to like, yes, we have to be on TikTok, right? I mean, it's like, and all these other different platforms. But I think that's why it is also about like building up the infrastructure, resourcing young people to help organize their own peers, right? And so I know there's a broad-based coalition of funding, like at least at the college level, there's been a lot of efforts in terms of organizing things on campus. But even for a lot of college campuses, for instance, I know a lot of universities celebrate National Voter Registration Day. But the reality is that I know, at least in the API community, student organizations, even a week later, when they're doing outreach to their peers, they were still yielding more voter registrations, right? And so that's why it goes back to that we need people that look like us to actually be able to engage and young people to like engage with their own peers, to actually go ahead and get them registered and to actually make the case.
Thank you. And we've passed the mic to someone else, sir. Yes, we're ready for your question.
I think relying on young people is sort of problematic. I was a young person once. In 1968, we fought very hard to get the young people to vote, and Nixon won. In 1972, we tried again, and Nixon won again. In 1976, Carter, who was a little bit better, he won. Then Reagan won. It wasn't until that new generation got to be close to 50 in 1992. So, I mean, I think, the issues that you address young people to, like when you have both candidates talking about continuing the war in Gaza and genocide, it makes it very difficult to get young people to vote. So I think you need to deal with the issues more substantially than just whether they're young or old.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that into the conversation. And of course, we know that older voters vote more. So, you're absolutely right.
Although we are now looking at the data that Gen Z is actually, their participation rate is actually higher than other generations at that same age.
Ooh. And remind us what age group that spans, because people don't all agree.
Actually, that I need a lot.
Okay. All right. Mike, did you have anything else to add to that?
What, in terms of the youth vote?
Or just
I
older
think,
voters?
Some of the innovations I have seen is the tradition, the moving away from that traditional outreach of mailers, phone banking, in even text. That I don't know how many people are streaming. We're seeing very targeted campaign ads on your streaming services. Even here, when I was watching something all the way in Washington D.C. in a different IP address in Washington D.C., getting ads from California, being able to track that. And then also looking at what the DNC did this summer in terms of inviting social media influencers and having a very targeted focus of how do you covet and you build those relationships and get your messaging out there. So we see some of those innovations, and we in our Latino API survey, we did do the traditional ranking of top priority issues, and of course, it was crime, immigration was a little bit in the middle, jobs and the economy, and interesting. The war in the Middle East wasn't in the top 5, at least for the Latino and API voters.
That's interesting.
We've been seeing that in all of our surveys as well.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Oh, did we pass the mic? Did you get the mic? Okay.
I ended up with the mic.
Okay.
Hi, everyone.
Oh, and then we'll move it over here.
Okay. Lucia Vitale, University of California, Santa Cruz. So Mike Mendez, you mentioned the impact of climate change disasters abroad and how that informs in some ways the voting preferences of Latino communities in the US. And I'm kind of especially reflecting on the genocide in Gaza and especially on mobilization by Arab American voters around this issue specifically, calling for an arms embargo, a ceasefire. I wonder if any of the panelists up on stage now or any of the panelists from the first panel might have any reflections on how, for example, US interventions abroad in Latin American countries might influence voter preferences in the US, whether you notice that or what that looks like.
Does anyone feel like they can answer that?
Yeah, no, but the only thing that we do see in this in the elections constantly, when you talk about Latinos that are supporting Trump or a more conservative approach, many of them may come from countries where there was a fascist or a socialist regime that they saw their society change. In Venezuela, Honduras, maybe even Colombia, and that has an impact on their experience here. And when you throw out the word socialist and put that on like the Kamala Harris, that does have an impact. But going to my area of expertise is climate change, and yeah, absolutely that lived experience, that embodied experience of experiencing a disaster or climate change impact in your home countries if you were born outside the United States, and definitely here in the States. And it is not just API or Latino. We see that across the board of all demographic groups that have gone through a hurricane. They may not call it climate change, but there's some type of acknowledgement of how does that type of event influence them.
I wanted to actually pick up on what he said as well, because of my work with Cubans. Of course, that's a big, reason why they take the position that they do. And I just wanted to make that point, because it's not, the idea is not to down Cubans, because we do want to understand where they're coming from, having come from a nation that, as you talked about, they had a completely different communist government. And so coming here, they have a completely different perspective in relation to the political arena.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I know that there was a question back here. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Dr. Chandra Char. So I'm a registered voter in DC, and I have been for 2 years. And now that the election information is being distributed, I never received mine. And so that leads to a question of mine of, I Googled and I asked people, and I did put in a lot of effort to try and find out that information and educate myself about who the candidates are. And it was really difficult to find that information. And so I'm curious about, based on your expertise, what are some recommendations that you have, and what are some easy ways that we can make this information accessible, available, and consistent for minoritized voters and for all voters, so that they have an educated vote going in, rather than voting how their friends or their communities or their churches recommend that they vote. And that probably comes from that mass logic of voting how your friends vote, because there's not a lot of information available. Thank you.
Right. So we really recommend the League of Women Voters, vote411.org. They make it really easy for you to put your information in, and they'll actually come up with a sample of your ballot and who's actually on your ballot.
Mm-hmm.
And then depending on the state, they actually also have tools like that. So for instance, my dad, he's from Ohio, so I was helping him with his early vote. So I was able to go onto their website and just put in his information, and then they pulled up a sample ballot, and I was able to print that out and walk him through it as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. Taught me something I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I was recently asked this question by some neighbors in our community association, and recommended the League of Conservation Voters for a nonpartisan type of approach to what's on the ballot. But also, depending on your political leanings, some of the major nonprofits in your county or your state also does voter guides. So if there's a nonprofit that is some type of policy or advocacy position that you agree with, I would look them up. And they're more increasingly, they're doing voter education initiatives and voter guides. And then one more thing I wanted to add about the home country's influence. So I just also want to talk about the historic moment in Mexico, that we had the first female president elected. And also the first climate scientist. So hopefully that will help some, yes, I hope so. She did do her postdoctoral work at the Lawrence Laboratory at Berkeley. So, so hopefully that'll have some influence about being able to envision a woman leader as president.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are out of time, but I hope you can join me in giving our panelists a round of applause. And I'm sure Tanya will let us know what we need to do next.
All right. So first, let's give a round of applause to all of our amazing speakers. Yes. Thank you all so much. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to have table discussions, because we know there's never enough time for questions, and we wanted to try a different way of engaging the audiences. So what we're going to do is each table has a number. You don't have to stay where you are. You can move if you like. Please skip to the next slide, Stephen. And okay, so what we're going to do, and if it doesn't work exactly, that's fine. If people want to double up, totally fine. But basically, Michael, Rodriguez Muñiz is already at table 1. He follows directions. Awesome. But Irene Vega will be at table 2. Mike Mendez here. Monica Gocin, Cristobal, Clarissa, Ray, Amada, Christina, Marco, Edwin. Manny's not here, so let's get that. And Christine will be at table 13. So please feel free to get up and just choose any table. And you're going to have a conversation about what is at stake for Latinos in the upcoming election. You can agree, totally double up, triple up. Yeah. Table discussions. We're now going to move to, we have closing remarks by Edwin Canizales, and these will be followed by a call to action by Cindy Benavides, who will join us virtually. So I'll turn it over to Edwin Canizales.
Hopefully you can see me because I'm really short. Anyway, listen, I don't have a lot of time, so whatever numbers I throw at you, you're gonna have to either believe me or Google it on your academic source of choice. But I'm been speaking to a lot of people, so I kind of gonna go script. Okay, I had a bunch of notes, but I'm not gonna talk about them. But I do want to begin with this that somebody made me think about just now. We work with a lot of groups. One of the groups that does they're responsible for the peaceful transition of power does a lot of really good research, and they found out that amongst the youth ages 18 to 34, only 15% of them think that the government is, they have trust in government, only 15%. They often think that the government is corrupt, that is broken, and is ineffective. They fail to realize that when the parents get their social security benefits and the veterans checks and all that stuff, that is government too. That is the 3.5 million civil servants that are doing hard work to keep the doors open. It's not the crazy AOCs on the left, and it's not the crazy Taylor Greens on the right that are pulling us apart, right? They're not the people who are saying, click on my Instagram and give me money so I can be famous and I can keep you angry at each other instead of compromising. Ultimately, the country works best when we are centrist. The country has always been better when we are centrist. There are a lot of things that are happening. I'm not supposed to call to action, but I do hope that, I know there are several states in where you guys are coming from right now that are gonna have some propositions for primary reform. I really hope some of those laws pass because I do hope that we go back to being centrist. How many of you, and don't be ashamed, you're in a safe place. How many of you have ever been registered Republicans? How many of you ever voted Republican? And how many of you young people have ever heard of a common sense Republican, like a George, and I know you can disagree. I know a lot of people from California here, but like a George Bush with, the doctrine of compassionate conservatism, or a Ronald Reagan that when his last day in office, he said he couldn't talk about anything about, defeating communism and whatever else he did. He talked about immigrants, about how important immigrants were. There was a time where the Republican Party was a party of principles, was a party that proposed something for you, and you can choose to vote for them or not. And when they will lose, they will shake the hands of the Democrats and go home. And then they will spend another 4 years trying to convince you to vote for them. Just like the Democrats did in their time too, when they were losing, right? They try to propose things to convince you to vote for them. That's the type of democracy you need to go back to. That's the type of country you need to go back to. So what I guess the message, and this was inspired by all the people talking over there, is that I really hope that you look at the consequences of this election and understand that it's not just voting for president, right? It's voting for everything else. It's propositions for reform if you have it in your state, making sure that you're not voting for somebody at the school level that believes that dinosaurs are the devil and it's just a test for you to not believe in God, right? You need to hopefully, do not leave any power on the table, so to speak, right? So I really hope that when you talk to your friends, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Most of you either voted or will vote, but I do hope that when you talk to people that do not vote or have doubts about the government, the non-12% young people that do not believe in government, I hope you try to convince them and make them understand that there are a lot of people who make a lot of money trying to keep you separated, but you need to really start pushing them off because it's just not good for us. It's not good for anybody. People overuse the word fascism, and I'm sorry, I'm going to use it. Fascism, and I've seen it because my family experienced it in Spain. 30 years of Franco and fascism, and nobody involving in trying to help us was a problem. There's a lot of graves in Spain that still have not been uncovered. A lot of great people your age died there. You know, fascism is interesting. The funny thing about fascism is that it makes you feel really good inside, because if you're in a shit spot, somebody else, so long as you step on somebody else, that little sugar rush to your brain feels really good. And you get to oppress other people. And that's what, and now fascism is so good because it uses technology and AI. And, you know, besides the work I do, I do work with other cybersecurity people like MI5, FBI, people like that. And some of the stuff they're finding right now is crazy. There's early intervention for radicalization as early as 8 years of age, through gaming, through all kinds of things. And it's an interesting trend, because it used to be like, you know, it starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews, right? You might hate Jews on the left, so you kind of meet with the people that hate Jews on the right, and then together you start hating other people after you have the common denominator. But now it's like, you hate girls because they don't date you because you're 8 and ugly. Okay, come here, you hate somebody. You like, I don't know, Hawaiian shirts, and you have a gun, and you hate, I don't know, the man. Okay, come here. And then, you know, it's just like this weird trend, right? And ultimately, the one thing that you can learn from not from the right, because that's not the Republican Party, that's the extreme right, that's MAGA. The one thing you can learn from them is they're very good at building a huge tent to unify and beat your ideals. I was telling some people, and I tell this story to other people before, when a Nazi votes, he doesn't go on the booth and says, you know, I like Donald Trump and I like MAGA, but he likes Israel and I hate Jews. I'm going to compromise. I'm going to make a point, and I'm not going to vote for Trump. No, they go in and vote for Trump. Meanwhile, the left, they go and say, I got issues about Gaza. I'm willing to give up my right, my autonomy as a woman. I'm wanting to not get more funding for education because I want to make a point, because the sugar rush feels good in my head. And I'm willing to give up all that and make a point. I'm willing to say, I'm standing with my, you know, I don't know, I'm making this up. I'm Arabic, and I'm going to stand for my friends in Gaza, and I'm not going to vote for so-and-so because I want to make a point. Guess what? The point that you just made is you like losing. So I encourage you to vote, and whatever you believe, left or right, go with what your tent is telling you. And stop compromising on 1 or 2 issues, please. Anyway, these words are not the words of Lula, these are the words of Edwin Canizales. So just FYI, that way I don't get fired. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwin. And now we're going to move to Cindy Benavides. Give us 1 minute to make the transition to a virtual panelist. Hi, Cindy. Welcome. We're so pleased to have you with us. And we are grateful for you making it possible to give a call to action at the end of our panel. Thank you, Cindy, and I'll turn it over to you.
Muchísimas gracias. Buenas noches. Good evening to everyone. I am so sad and bummed that I could not be with you today in DC, which is our headquarters. I'm actually in the battleground state of Nevada today, making sure that we're speaking about voting and turning out our Latino community out to vote. I have to tell you that it's so inspiring to be with you here tonight. You are the best of our community. You're the ones que le echan ganas, the ones who get things done, who truly believe in the power of progress, of community, of change, of the Latino voice. You know, my parents always taught me that when you go into someone's house, you must pay your respect. And so I want to thank the University of California, Washington Center, UCLA's Latino Politics and Policy Institute, and UCB's Institute of Governmental Studies for hosting this important discussion. I also want to congratulate all the phenomenal panelists and speakers who led this crucial and informative conversation about the monumental role the Latino electorate is playing in this high-stakes election. Huge shout out to my friends, Dr. Michael Rodriguez, Irene Vega, Clarissa Martinez, Irene Bueno, among so many others. I want to give a special acknowledgement to Christobal Alex, Latino Victory's founding president and current board member. You know, at Latino Victory, our mission is clear. It's to ensure that the Latino community is not just participating in democracy, but also leading it. Right now, as you may have heard, 36.2 million Latinos and Latinas and Latinx are eligible to register to vote. That's a powerful number, but it means nothing if we don't turn out to vote. As one of Latino Victory's founders, Henry Munoz, says, demography is not destiny. Having a powerhouse voting bloc means nothing if we don't harness its power. Because using our electoral power means we get to determine our own destiny. It means we have the opportunity to improve our family's well-being, increase our community's opportunities, and most importantly, protect our children's future. When we harness our electoral power and turn out to vote, we can elect government representatives, the local, state, and federal levels, who truly understand our needs, whether it's the rising cost of living, inflation, healthcare access, or climate change. You know, today we stand in unity on the shoulders of great giants, Latino leaders who have been on the move for justice and equality before many of us were even born. People like Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and our first Latino U.S. Senator, Dionisio Dennis Chavez, who served New Mexico from 1935 to 1962. Visionaries like our parents, our abuelitos and abuelitas, who when there was no way, made a way. We know the great price and sacrifice our families have paid and continue to pay. You know, as a community, we still yearn for true basic human dignity and respect. In today's political environment, there are some candidates who falsely accuse immigrants of abducting and eating pets, who without a wink throw out disparaging generalizations to see if it will resonate or create fear, who every 4 years, when there's a presidential election, use the issue of immigration as a wedge issue and political piñata. For the record, and I know that all of you know this, immigrants have always contributed to the fabric of our country. And when the pandemic hit, they were putting their lives on the line to make sure that we had food on the table and that our basic needs were met. For all our farm workers, meat packing workers, healthcare workers, educators, and frontline workers, gracias. And for those who have forgotten our recent contributions, you're welcome. You know, I want you to understand the moment we're living in America when a presidential candidate is using rhetoric to dehumanize an entire population. I want you to ask yourselves why. Let's call this for what it is: the belief that us, nosotros, the growing majority of people of color, should not have political power. The belief in the status quo whereupon communities of color live in poverty and don't have access to opportunities or capital to be able to prosper. The belief that Latinos and Hispanics were never here, even though we have been here since before the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty. The fact is that you can't erase our history. We were at the Alamo. We were here before Texas was Texas and before Nuevo Mexico was New Mexico. And we will continue to be here as Latinos grow from 64 million strong to over 120 million strong in just 3 decades. That means yours and my lifetime. 1 in 3 Americans will be of Latino ancestry. America, we are your present, your future, and your destiny. Latino young voters especially will play a key role in this election. In key states like Arizona, Colorado, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, and Virginia, young Latino voters made up the largest voting bloc among Latino voters. And every 30 seconds, Latinos are turning 18 years of age. Every 30 seconds, which means that close to 1 million Latinos will be turning of age and eligible to register to vote every single year for the next 10 years. More than 1/5 of Latinos who are eligible to vote this year will be voting in their first presidential election, and 30% of the Latino electorate consists of new voters since 2016. You know, we have less than 14 days to go. And I want to remind you that our greatest act of defiance is to vote. Our greatest way to protest is to vote. And our greatest way to rise up, represent our community, is to show up and vote. Please remember that our actions today will determine our tomorrow. We need to ensure that every vote turns into real political power. Latinos and Latinas have the power to change the future of this country, but only if we use our power. That's why our call to action tonight for all Latinos is simple: vote. It's important to make a plan to vote. And once you have a plan, bring your familia and friends. There's no better voter mobilization strategy than convincing our loved ones to turn out to vote. And our Latino families, as you know, roll together and we roll deep. So when Latinos turn out to vote, we elect candidates who can make policy changes that can improve our daily lives and have lasting, positive generational change. Not only for me, but for my children and my children's children. Lastly, I would not be doing my job if I did not ask you to run for office. For UC, although there's 500,000 elected positions in America, 500,000, Latinos only occupy a little bit over 7,000, or less than 2%. We make up 20% of the entire population, but when it comes to elected office, we're only 2%. I know that many of us did not grow up with parents telling us to run for office or be politicians. I certainly can tell you, nunca escuché a mi mamá decir, hija, cuando crezcas, quiero que seas política. But at this moment in time, our community needs us in these elected positions, whether to the local, at the state, or at the federal level. And remember that we need to be at the table. We need to be in the halls of Congress. And yes, one day soon, we will have our first Latina US president in the White House. Les quiero recordar that we have power. Sometimes we forget that we have power. Sometimes we give our power away. But voting is a form of exercising your power in this very important election. And I'm sure you have heard time and time again, this is the most important election of your lifetime. Well, this is the most important election of your lifetime and one of the most consequential. And when you hear people say, well, does my vote matter? Absolutely, it matters. We've seen elections that have been won by 1 to 2 votes. We've seen states that have been won by less than 2%, by 10,000 votes. I want you to think about that. And I also want you to think about who is pushing this narrative that your vote does not matter. This is where mi comunidad, mi gente, mis líderes, we have to stand up and make sure that our voices are heard at the polls. Muchísimas gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Cindy, for those powerful remarks. And she said it all much better than I could. So we'll leave it there. One last round of applause for everyone. Woo! Thank you very much. If this is your first time at UCDC, I hope it's not your last. And for those of you who live in the building, thank you for sharing your residential space with us. Thank you.